The squeak of the left wheel was the only sound Jedediah Stone allowed himself to make. It was a miserable, complaining noise, a metal-on-metal grind that spoke of grit and a lack of grease, and it grated on his soul with every turn. For a man who had once moved through the high country with less noise than a shadow, this constant whining announcement of his presence was a particular kind of hell. The chair itself, made of stout oak and iron, was a cage, but the sound was the voice of that cage, reminding him and everyone in the Redemption Gulch train depot that he was broken. He was a mountain of a man, even seated. His shoulders strained the fabric of his heavy wool coat, and a chest thick with muscle filled the space between the chair's arms. A wild, tangled beard the color of dark river stones fell to his lap, and his hair, long and unbound, hung past his shoulders. These were the things men once saw. They saw the strength in his hands that could field dress an elk or heft a timber for a cabin wall without complaint. Now they only saw the chair. They saw the heavy woolen blanket covering two legs that did nothing. Jedediah rolled himself to the ticket counter, the squeaking wheel counting out a rhythm of defeat on the dusty floorboards. The station agent, a thin man named Abernathy with a face pinched by the perpetual Montana cold, looked down his nose. He didn't look at Jedediah's face, but at the top of his head, as if addressing a child. "Help you?" Abernathy asked, his tone suggesting he very much doubted it. "One ticket, westbound, as far as it goes." Jedediah's voice was a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. It was a voice that belonged on a mountaintop, not in this drafty, smoke-stained depot. Abernathy finally lowered his gaze, his eyes flicking over the wheelchair with a practiced disdain. "That'll be the Union Pacific line, changing at Ogden, but I can't sell you a ticket." The words hung in the cold air. "Why not?" Jedediah asked, keeping his voice level. He had learned that anger only made them smug. "Company policy," Abernathy said, tapping a finger on a stack of telegraph flimsies. "We can't take on the liability. A man in your condition requires assistance. We're a transport company, not a hospital." Jedediah's hands tightened on the wooden wheels of his chair, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the eyes of the other passengers on his back. A woman with two small children pulled them closer. A pair of drifters heading for the silver mines snickered into their hands. He was a spectacle, a problem. "I don't need assistance," Jedediah said, the words costing him more than the price of the ticket. "I handle my own affairs." "Can you climb the steps into the passenger car?" Abernathy countered, a sliver of triumph in his voice. "Can you make your way to the necessary facilities unassisted in a moving train? What if there's a delay, a breakdown in the snow? You become a burden on the other passengers. It's not possible." Each question was a hammer blow, driving home the nails of his confinement. Jedediah had no answer for them. He had imagined it, of course. He had imagined using his arms to haul his dead weight up the steps, imagined the humiliation of it, the struggle. But he had believed it was a struggle he had the right to undertake. He had not imagined he would be denied even the chance to try. Therefore, he found himself with nothing left to say. The last of his money, saved from selling off his traps and the deed to his high country cabin, was folded in his pocket. Enough for a ticket to somewhere else, somewhere the pitying looks and whispered comments wouldn't follow him. But money meant nothing if no one would take it. He was stuck. A man built for wide open spaces, trapped in a 10-by-10 box of a depot in a town that didn't want him, unable to move on. He was about to turn, to push himself back out into the biting wind and the gathering snow, when a new voice cut through the depot's low murmur. It was quiet, yet it carried a strange authority. "I will purchase 2 tickets on the westbound train." Jedediah turned his head. Standing a few feet away was a woman. She was Chinese, her face composed and still, her dark eyes missing nothing. She was dressed in a gown of dark green silk, the color of a forest in shadow, a fabric far too fine for a dusty Montana depot. Over it she wore a simple, heavy gray wool scarf, wrapped high against the cold. She was not beautiful in the way of the saloon girls, all paint and easy smiles. There was a severity to her, a sense of immense self-possession. Her hands, tucked into a small muff, were perfectly still. Abernathy's expression shifted from disdain to a different kind of dismissal. "Ma'am," he began, his tone patronizing. "My name is Mrs. Lynn Wynn," she stated, not as an introduction, but as a correction. "My late husband, Mr. Lynn, was the proprietor of the Redemption Gulch Freight Company. I am sure you cashed his checks often enough." The station agent's face paled slightly. The Lynn Freight Company was the lifeblood of the town, hauling supplies from the railhead to the outlying mines and homesteads. Abernathy cleared his throat. "Of course, Mrs. Lynn. My apologies. 2 tickets?" "Yes, one for myself and one for my associate," she said, her gaze moving for the first time to Jedediah. It was a startlingly direct look, not of pity, but of assessment. It was the way a man might look at a horse he was thinking of buying. "This gentleman." Abernathy sputtered. "Mrs. Lynn, I already explained. Company policy." "Your policy is a convenience, not a law," she interrupted smoothly. "I will sign any waiver you require, indemnifying the Union Pacific Railroad against any and all liability. Furthermore, my own men will be here to see my associate boarded. They will lift him and his chair into the car. They will do the same at our destination. Your employees will not be required to touch him." She paused, letting the words settle. "There is no burden. There is only a paying customer. 2, in fact." She spoke with the calm certainty of someone who knew the power of money and contracts. Jedediah watched, silent. No one had ever spoken for him like this. People either spoke at him or around him, their words coated in pity or annoyance. This woman spoke of him as an asset, a piece of business. It was insulting, and yet, in a strange way, it was the first time he had felt like a man, and not a cripple, since the day the spruce tree fell. Abernathy, faced with the town's most powerful widow and the undeniable logic of her argument, wilted. He slid 2 tickets across the counter. "That'll be $18. Mrs. Lynn produced a small leather purse and counted out the coins with brisk efficiency. She handed one of the tickets to Jedediah. Her fingers did not brush his. The transaction was entirely impersonal. "Be ready in 1 hour," she said to him, her voice low. "The train does not wait." Then, without another word, she turned and walked out of the depot, leaving Jedediah with a ticket to a future he hadn't asked for, purchased by a woman he didn't know. The loop was open. He had a way out of Redemption Gulch, but it seemed he had just traded one cage for another, this one owned by a quiet Chinese widow in a green silk dress. Jedediah was not a man given to trust. The mountains had taught him that survival depended on self-reliance, on reading the signs, on knowing that a shift in the wind or the crack of a branch could mean the difference between life and death. But sitting there in the depot, with the ticket in his hand and the memory of Mrs. Lynn's assessing gaze, he felt a profound sense of dislocation. He had no other options. Therefore, when 2 of her freight workers, burly men with calloused hands, appeared an hour later, he did not resist. They lifted him, chair and all, with a practiced ease that spoke of hoisting crates and barrels. It was a swift, undignified process, and he endured it with a stone-faced silence, his eyes fixed on the distant, snow-dusted peaks visible through the grimy train window. He was placed in the passenger car, his chair secured with rope to the luggage rack. Mrs. Lynn was already seated across the aisle, reading a small leather-bound book. She did not acknowledge him. The train lurched into motion, and Redemption Gulch slid away. They traveled for 2 hours in silence, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a stark contrast to the quiet tension inside the car. Jedediah watched the landscape change from rugged hills to vast open plains, a white blanket stretching to the horizon. It was a world he could no longer navigate. He was a passenger, carried along by the decisions of others. The crisis, when it came, did not happen on the train. It happened at a small, windswept stop called Jericho Crossing, little more than a water tower and a combination telegraph office and general store. The train was taking on water, a 20-minute delay. Mrs. Lynn stood, smoothing her dress. "I have business here," she said, her first words to him since the depot. "Wait for me." Jedediah watched her step down from the train, her green dress a slash of color against the snow. She walked with a purpose that seemed at odds with the desolate surroundings. She disappeared into the general store. The minutes ticked by. 15, 20. The conductor called out a 5-minute warning. Jedediah felt a knot of unease tighten in his gut. She had his future in her hands, and she had vanished. Then he saw her. She was walking back from the store, but she was not alone. A large, well-dressed man walked beside her, his hand on her elbow. Even from a distance, Jedediah could see the man's proprietary air, the way he leaned in close to speak. Mrs. Lynn's posture was rigid, her face a blank mask. This was not a friendly conversation. The man was Bartholomew Thorne. Jedediah didn't know his name then, but he knew his type. The expensive wool coat, the polished boots, the smile that never reached his eyes. He was a man accustomed to taking what he wanted. As they neared the train, his voice carried on the cold, thin air. "A foolish arrangement, Win. Your husband was a sensible man. He would never have left things in the hands of a woman, especially not one with your proclivities for charity." His eyes flicked toward the train, toward the window where Jedediah sat, a clear and insulting implication. "My husband trusted me, Mr. Thorne." Mrs. Lynn's voice was ice. "And this is my affair, not yours." "Everything concerning the Lynn Freight Company is my affair," Thorne said, his smile tightening. "I am your partner, and I will not see our assets squandered on vagrants." They stopped at the base of the train steps. The conductor was impatient, waving them on. Thorne blocked her path. It was a public confrontation, played out for the handful of onlookers at the tiny station. He was using the community's gaze as a weapon, trying to humiliate her into submission. Jedediah watched, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He was roped in, helpless, a caged bear. But then he saw something that surprised him. Mrs. Lynn did not back down. She did not flush with anger or shame. She simply looked at Thorne with that same unnerving analytical calm she had used on Jedediah. "You are not my partner, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice clear and precise. "You were my husband's. Upon his death, his shares passed to me. You own 49% of a company I control. Check the territorial charter if you're confused." This was not the response of a frightened widow. This was the cold, hard language of business. Thorne's confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. He had expected tears or hysterics. He had gotten a lesson in corporate law. He recovered quickly, his voice turning silky and dangerous. "A piece of paper won't protect you. You need a man to run that business. A white man. The community expects it." Suddenly, a commotion erupted from the other side of the platform. A heavy freight wagon, overloaded with barrels and left improperly braked on a slight incline, began to roll. It picked up speed, heading directly for a tethered horse and, beyond it, the general store's front window. People shouted and scattered. Thorne and Mrs. Lynn were momentarily forgotten. The wagon was a runaway beast of wood and iron. But Jedediah saw it all from his elevated vantage point. He saw the trajectory, the danger, and he saw a long, iron-tipped freight hook lying on the platform, used for loading ice blocks into the train's refrigeration car. He could not run. He could not stand. But his arms were the arms of Jedediah Stone. "The hook!" he roared, his voice booming through the sudden chaos. The sound shocked everyone, Thorne included. One of the freight workers who had been watching the confrontation looked up at Jedediah. "Get me the hook," Jedediah commanded, pointing. The man, acting on pure instinct at the sheer authority in Jedediah's voice, scrambled to obey. He grabbed the 10-foot pole and ran it to the train car door. Jedediah leaned out, his powerful shoulders straining. He took the heavy hook in his hands. It felt familiar, a tool, an extension of his will. The wagon was rumbling past, only feet from his window. He had one chance. With a grunt that tore from his throat, he swung the hook like a scythe. He didn't aim for the barrels or the wheels. He aimed for the heavy rear axle. The iron point connected with a solid chunk of sound. Jedediah locked his elbows, planted his body against the frame of his chair, and held on. The force nearly ripped his arms from their sockets. The muscles in his back and shoulders screamed in protest. His chair groaned, the ropes holding it straining against their knots. But the hook held. The wagon, its momentum snagged by an immovable object anchored by a mountain of a man, slewed sideways, its wheels screeching. It shuddered to a halt, inches from the terrified horse. Silence descended on the platform. Everyone stared. They stared at the stopped wagon, and then they stared at Jedediah, still holding the hook, his chest heaving. Thorne's mouth was slightly agape. Mrs. Lynn looked up at him, and for the first time, her expression was not one of assessment, but of something else. Something akin to respect. The community had witnessed a reversal. The helpless cripple in the chair had just prevented a disaster with nothing but a tool and the strength of his own 2 arms. The conductor, shaking his head in disbelief, finally blew his whistle. Thorne, his public display of dominance shattered, gave Mrs. Lynn a look of pure venom before turning and stalking away. The freight workers unhooked the pole and quickly secured the wagon. As the train began to move again, Mrs. Lynn stepped aboard and took her seat. She looked across the aisle at Jedediah. "Thank you," she said quietly. Jedediah just nodded, his arms aching. He had acted, not to save her, but to do what needed doing. But he had saved her from public humiliation nonetheless. The surface conflict seemed resolved. Thorne was gone, for now. But as the train picked up speed, Mrs. Lynn leaned slightly toward him, her voice barely a whisper above the noise of the tracks. "That was a simple matter of property," she said, her eyes dark and serious. "But you should know that, mister. Thorne is not a man who gives up, and what he truly wants is the least of my troubles." That night they did not stop at a hotel. The train pulled into the bustling town of Three Forks, where the railroad diverged. A carriage was waiting for Mrs. Lynn. Her men transferred Jedediah from the train to the carriage with the same impersonal efficiency. They rode through darkened streets to a large 2-story building on the edge of town. A sign, barely visible in the lantern light, read, "Lynn Freight Company." It was an office, a warehouse, and a home, all in one. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of paper, ink, and tea. It was a place of work. She led him not to a guest room, but to the main office, a large space dominated by a heavy desk, shelves of ledgers, and maps of the territory pinned to the walls. She lit a lamp and put a kettle on the pot-bellied stove that glowed in the corner. This was her command center. She moved with a quiet grace, preparing 2 cups of tea. The silence wasn't awkward. It was heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, she brought a cup to a small table near where his chair was positioned. She sat opposite him. "I owe you an explanation," she said, her gaze unwavering. It was the beginning of the private honesty he had been waiting for. "You don't owe me anything," Jedediah rumbled. "You bought me a ticket." "I did more than that," she corrected. "I hired you, though you did not know it at the time." She took a sip of her tea, organizing her thoughts. "My husband, Lin Kai, built this business from nothing. He was a good man, a clever man, but he was also a trusting man. He took on Bartholomew Thorne as a partner to give the business a white face, to open doors that would be closed to him. It worked, but Thorne is not a builder. He is a vulture." She explained that when her husband died of a fever 2 months prior, Thorne had assumed he would easily take control. He had tried to buy her shares for a pittance, assuming a grieving Chinese widow would be helpless and ignorant. When she refused, he found another way. "The law in this territory is written by men like Thorne for men like Thorne," she said, her voice laced with a cold anger. "There is a clause in the company's founding charter. In the event of my husband's death, if I did not remarry or appoint a male business manager of sound mind and body within 3 months, control of the company would revert to the surviving partner until such a time as I did. The 3 months are almost up." Jedediah finally understood. "He wants to declare you incompetent. Worse, he wants to prove I am incapable of managing the business alone. He has friends. He has the ear of the territorial judge. He planned to let my time run out and take everything." She looked at him directly. "I needed a manager, someone to satisfy the letter of the law. But if I hired any man from this town, Thorne would have bought him or intimidated him within a week." Her plan, born of desperation, was both cunning and cruel. "So I went to the depot looking for someone else, someone no one would suspect, someone Thorne would dismiss as irrelevant, a prop, a name on a piece of paper to buy me time while my lawyers in San Francisco searched for a loophole." The words hit Jedediah harder than Abernathy's refusal. A prop. A vagrant. He was not her associate. He was her scarecrow. "You used me," he said, the words flat. "Yes," she said, without apology. "I did. I saw a man in a desperate situation, and I used it to my advantage. It was a business decision. But then I saw you on the platform today. You are not a prop, Mr. Stone. You are a fortress." From a locked drawer in her desk, she removed a heavy sheaf of papers bound in ribbon, a physical object that carried the weight of her entire world. She laid it on the table. It was the deed to the company, the land, the warehouses, and tucked inside was a letter from Thorne's lawyer, a finely worded piece of legal venom that laid out his strategy in cold, clear terms. It spoke of her female sensibilities and racial limitations, making her an unfit steward of such a significant enterprise. "He will not stop at legal maneuvers," she said, her voice dropping lower. "My husband kept meticulous records. He discovered Thorne was skimming freight charges, creating false manifests. Kai was preparing to expose him when the fever took him. I believe Thorne knows I have the ledgers. That is what he truly wants. Not just the company, but the proof of his crimes." The danger was no longer just financial. It was physical. Thorne wasn't just a predator. He was a cornered one. As if summoned by her words, a heavy banging echoed from the front door of the warehouse. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the sound of a fist against solid wood. Mrs. Lynn's composure finally cracked. A flicker of fear crossed her face. She stood and went to the office window, peering through the curtains into the dark yard. "It's him," she whispered, "and he's brought the marshal." The second major antagonist had arrived. Thorne was escalating, moving from social pressure to the full force of the law. He wasn't waiting for the deadline. He was forcing the issue now. Jedediah felt a cold dread, but also a hot spark of anger. He had been a pawn in her game, but Thorne's naked prejudice and greed offended something deep within him. He had been dismissed his whole life for one reason or another. First for being a solitary mountain man, now for being a cripple. He recognized the same casual cruelty in Thorne's intentions toward Mrs. Lynn. She turned from the window, her face pale in the lamplight. "You can go," she said, her voice strained. "There is a room in the back. He won't find you. In the morning you can take the train. I will give you enough money to go anywhere you want. This is not your fight." She was offering him an escape, the very thing he had craved that morning in the depot. He could be free, a drifter again, just one on wheels. He could leave her to face Thorne and the law alone. It was the sensible thing to do, but as he looked at her, standing small and defiant in the center of the room she refused to surrender, he knew he couldn't. Leaving would be an admission that Abernathy and Thorne and all the others were right, that he was useless, a burden, a man who could only save himself. He made a choice. It was a choice that would cost him the simple freedom he thought he wanted, tying him to this place, to this woman, to this fight. It would cost him the anonymity of being a stranger. "No," he said, his voice filling the quiet office. "This is my fight now." He pushed his chair forward toward the door. "Let them in, Mrs. Lynn. The company manager is ready to receive them." By the time the spring thaw turned the streets of Three Forks to a thick, impassable mud, the sign outside the warehouse had been repainted. It now read, in bold, clean letters, "Lynn and Stone Freight Company." The change was more than just cosmetic. It was a statement of fact that the entire territory had come to accept. The 4 months after that night had been a quiet, brutal war fought not with guns, but with ledgers, timetables, and the law. Thorne's attempt to have Jedediah dismissed as an unfit vagrant had backfired spectacularly. In front of the marshal, Jedediah had laid out a plan for restructuring the freight routes to the northern mines, a plan so detailed and logical, based on his intimate knowledge of the mountain passes, that it left the lawman impressed and Thorne speechless. Mrs. Lynn, meanwhile, had used the time Jedediah bought her to bring her lawyer from San Francisco. They presented the ledgers, proving Thorne's embezzlement. Faced with prison, Thorne had sold his shares to Mrs. Lynn for a fraction of their worth and disappeared, his power broken by the two people he had underestimated most. Their partnership had blossomed into a formidable enterprise. Mrs. Lynn was the mind, her shrewd negotiations and meticulous accounting winning lucrative contracts, including a vital one to supply the Fort Ellis garrison. Jedediah was the muscle in the iron will. From a specially constructed ramp and platform on the loading dock, he oversaw the freight crews. His booming voice directed the complex ballet of wagons, mules, and men with an authority no one dared question. He knew the weight of things, the balance, the stress a wagon axle could take. He could look at a team of mules and know if they could make a pass before the next snow. The men, who had first seen a cripple, now saw a commander who missed nothing and demanded the best. They respected him, and through him they respected her. One bright afternoon in May, they stood on that platform together, watching the last of a massive shipment of grain and salted beef being loaded for the fort. The quartermaster, a fussy captain from back east, handed a signed receipt and a heavy pouch of gold coin to Mrs. Lynn. "A pleasure doing business with you, ma'am," the captain said, tipping his hat. "Most reliable freight outfit in Montana. Your manager," he added, nodding toward Jedediah, "runs a tight ship. Scares the devil out of me, if I'm honest." Mrs. Lynn allowed herself a small, rare smile. "Mr. Stone is our greatest asset." After the wagons had rumbled out of the yard, a comfortable quiet settled over the place. The late afternoon sun was warm on their faces. They had won. Not just the company, but a place in the world that was entirely their own, built on their own terms. The community, which had once watched with suspicion, now saw only success. Their judgment had caught up to the truth. That evening they sat on the small porch of the living quarters attached to the office. The world was alive with the sound of crickets and the smell of damp earth. Mrs. Lynn brought out 2 cups of tea, just as she had on that first night. Jedediah wasn't in his wheelchair. He had transferred himself to the top step of the porch, his back against a post, his powerful arms making the move with practiced ease. The chair sat empty beside him, a tool at rest. It was no longer a cage. It was simply a part of the landscape of his life. He was mending a piece of leather harness, his large hands surprisingly nimble. She sat on the chair beside him, sipping her tea. They didn't need many words between them anymore. They had built a life out of shared work and mutual respect, a bond stronger than any spoken promise. He looked out over the freight yard, at the wagons lined up for the morning runs, at the new sign bearing both their names. He thought of that man in the Redemption Gulch depot, a man trapped by what he had lost. He no longer felt like that man. "You know," he said, his voice a low rumble in the twilight, "I came west looking for a place so big a man could lose himself in it." He paused, testing the headstall in his hands. "Funny thing is, I had to be stuck in one place to finally find myself." Mrs. Lynn watched him, her expression soft in the fading light. She didn't offer any grand pronouncements about fate or courage. The truth was simpler than that. It was a truth forged in a cold train depot and a dusty freight yard. It was about seeing what others could not. A person's worth, it turns out, is not measured by the strength in their legs, but by the conviction in their heart. And sometimes the person society deems broken is the only one strong enough to help you build something that will last.